Returning to the topic of the subject in Lacan, the fourth talk in this series is simply entitled As Gap as Failure. I'd like to begin by giving Lorenzo Chiesa a little bit of a shout out. His book, Subjectivity and Otherness, right near the beginning of that book, looks like page 6, gives us an interesting snippet. I've referred to this several times before. Lacan's subject amounts to irreducible lack, he says. Irreducible lack, also not a lack that can be summarily remedied. The Lacanian subject is a subjectivized lack, not a lacking subject. This is what I was trying to demonstrate with my hopeless failed attempt to put the bar before the S, but it's also crucial, corrective, and useful to insistently try to bear that in mind, because otherwise we have this idea that there was subject prior to lack, there was subject prior to the being bardness, which is the subject. So just to add that reference point. Another quick reference point is inspired by Bruce Fink's account of the four discourses in his classic 1995 text called, tellingly enough, The Lacanian Subject. He makes a comment, and let me just preface it by saying this is all comes out, this is what I'm going to add here is a simplification of a more kind of elaborate series of theoretical moves. But one way of understanding the subject in relationship to this symbolic is to bear in mind that when later Lacan starts to talk about the four discourses, he gives us this new vocabulary, this new conceptual vocabulary, whereby he talks about master signifiers. Signifiers which paradoxically count more, have more power of sorts. And master signifiers being given this notation, this mathematical notation of S1, the master signifier, Lacan. Lacan is a signifier which organizes an awful lot, which has a kind of effect of mastery. It creates a discursive field, whereas S2 is considered to be knowledge. So when a master signifier works, like psychoanalysis, like whatever, patriotism, you have a whole series of other signifiers which are arranged and start to make sense, start to make discursive sense. Anyways, without elaborating too much, what we could say then is this is in Lacanian theory that when this relationship starts to work of a master signifier that arranges, that knits together, coheres a whole discursive field of other signifiers, S2 or knowledge, the effect of this is to produce a subject. And let's see if I can give a quote. So I'm borrowing a little bit from my own book, 6 Moments in Lacan, and having commented on the Fink statement there, it is the creation of a new relationship between a given master signifier and other signifying elements which allows for a subject position. A subject, in a sense, is created via this effect of signifiers. So we're not able to elaborate on that too much, but just to keep it in place, so we've got several reference points to take us back to Lacan's work where we can try and explore some of these ideas. I gave before an example from a kind of comedic bad B-movie comedic example of how we might dramatize one element of the subject that Zizek uses. The man who sees his car getting towed away, or who he thinks is someone else's car, runs off, laughs at the guy, then realizes it's his car. There's another more kind of elaborate example of that, which he includes in Less Than Nothing, The Great Big Home. And it's kind of variation on the same joke. A man and his friend, they go to the theater, it's really boring, they're not really enjoying it. The guy says to his friend, look, I need to pee, I'm just gonna duck out, I'll be back in a bit. Where's the toilet? The guy says, I don't know, just go around the back. So he leaves the theater, he can't find his way around the building, eventually finds a funny door, and there he finds, like, he's in this private space where there's a flower pot. So, he has a pee in the flower pot. No one seems to be around, goes back to his seat, and his friend says, you just missed the best bit in the whole play. Some idiot just came in and walked in and peed in a flower pot. So in both of these silly examples, we've got a kind of temporal split. We've got this split between the subject. The subject is essentially, and this maybe is the crucial point, the subject is exactly the disparity between those two things. The subject is exactly the disparity, the inability to put those two things easily together. Commenting on this silly example, Zizek says it's in this delay between seeing and recognizing that the subject is experienced in its purest form, a delay. So here the example is more about temporality, the delay, rather than the speech examples where there's the enunciation statement split. But in both of them, there's an irreducible split. And the seeing and recognition split in the temporal delay examples gives us, says Zizek, the subject in its purest form. In other words, it's an instance which foregrounds that disparity. Now, if we had more time, we could do a wonderful piece of theoretical work. In Lacan's seminar, The Logic, the Fantasy, he does a whole series of theoretical moves. Slavoj Žižek is very inspired by a book by Francois Balmez, or Balmar, I don't know how you pronounce these French names, who does a whole engagement with how Lacan makes reference to Descartes' famous, I think, therefore I am. We could make very brief reference to it, but what's kind of interesting here is that the kind of commonplace wisdom is that, oh, Descartes gets it wrong with I think, therefore I am. This is too, phenomenology spends a lot of time saying, well, this is a dualism that we don't like. But what becomes surprising in Lacan is that it's not the case that later Lacan summarily rejects this notion of the Cartesian cogito. Rather, and certainly in the late Lacan, it's precisely this cogito, I think, the I think, which is typically opposed to I am, or seen to be as disjunctive, so on and so forth, that the Descartes position is precisely that I think, therefore I am, that those two things are unified, okay? Thinking and being, I think, therefore I am, and existence are the same. But it is in late Lacan that the cogito is embraced precisely in view of the fact that it itself embodies an impossibility, namely that of reconciling the I that speaks and the I that is spoken of. So it's also contained in less than nothing, and again, we don't have time to fill out all the various conceptual moves, but anyone who's familiar with Lacan will know that he intervenes in and borrows and plays with, experiments with the famous I think, therefore I am, punctuating it in different ways, trying to emphasize and subvert it in certain different kinds of ways. But interestingly, at the end, you could say that the very fact that that statement, I think, therefore I am, is so fundamentally, potentially disjunctive, so fundamentally irreconcilable, is precisely what makes it useful. The cogito, thus understood as essentially non-bindable, as essentially barred, as essentially non-integrated, gives us a nice way of thinking about the subject. Now we're going to try to do a little bit more work with Zizek, and I admit that things will get a little bit philosophical. So we need to take a deep breath. We could do this thing. We're going to jump into the ticklish subject. Now we've just made the point that contrary to what we may have expected, Descartes becomes an ally in how we might think of the subject. Zizek does a similar move here in the ticklish subject. Towards the beginning of the book, he makes this point where he says that Immanuel Kant and the German idealists are in fact to be credited for seeing in the I an empty space beyond all ideological fixity. Seeing in this empty space a negative power whose withdrawal from reality also opens up the space for its symbolic reconstitution. Now that is a big mouthful, lots of concepts going on there, but I just want to, rather than say this directly pertains absolutely to the Lacanian subject, display up a couple of points of articulation here. Number one, this idea of a negative power and an empty space. Both of those things resonate interestingly with what we're trying to say about the subject. The subject is, in a sense, a kind of emptiness. The subject is also, though, a potentiality of realization, which is the point we made right back at the beginning of these lectures. Also, here we get this motif that comes up again and again in Zizek's rearticulation of Lacan, that when we think about the subject, we're thinking constantly about void and error, about negativity and split, about a kind of nothingness and disjunction. Now, this is where the seemingly bad news turns out to be some good news. The bad news, that is, of the split subject, irreconcilability of the subject, is a kind of good news, because as split, as involving this disjunction, this failure of the subject, the failure of the subject ever to be fully encapsulated, ever to be whole, also means something quite important politically. And that means that the subject, Judith Butler, I think, also takes up this point in some places, that if the subject is incommensurable, the subject can never be fully interpolated. It can never be fully, absolutely saturated or controlled by ideology. So this is an argument that lots of the Slovene school colleagues will make. We're not going to develop it much here, simply to say, though, that what seems to be given to us now is that when we have this notion of the subject, even within all its splitness, its barredness, its irreconcilability, brings with it a kind of agentic potentiality, and also a potentiality and agency, a realization capacity which outstrips the power of ideology to fully control it. Zizek doesn't make the point this way, but we could also hold that the subject that is possessed of the death drive, a whole series of talks on the death drive that we've already done, cannot be totalized or fully overdetermined by ideology. So let's us then start to draw to a conclusion, and we're going to pull out a couple of passages from the ticklish subject, which we'll comment on. The first comes on page 157. Nothingness counted as something, says Zizek, is the most concise formula of the Lacanian barred subject. Nothingness counted as something is the most concise formula. We have this moment. To be meta-theoretical for a while, we often see this move in Lacanian theory where nothingness seems to be converted into a potential of somethingness, where nothingness is, as it were, turned inside out. But we've got this nothingness counted as something is the most concise formula of the Lacanian barred subject. On page 156, he says, does this line of argumentation not tell us something about the conditions of being subject? You become something, you become subject only after going through a 0 point, only after being deprived of empirical contingent features that support your identity. He continues, modern subjectivity emerges when the subject perceives themselves as out of joint, as excluded from the order of things. And again, what I'm trying to give a gloss on here is this idea of how the bad news is also the good news, that there is potentiality and realization potential within the subject, even though they are within the symbolic. A lengthier quote comes on page 158. In a passage where, entitled The Lacanian Subject, Slavoj Žižek says, and I quote, the subject is strictly correlative with ontological undecidability. Correlative with ontological undecidability. This precarious status of the subject relies on the Kantian insight that reality is non-all, ontologically not fully constituted, so it needs the supplement of the subject. It continues, subject is the contingency that grounds the very positive ontological order, that is, the vanishing mediator whose self-effacing gesture transforms the pre-ontological chaotic multitude into the semblance of positive objective order of reality. Again, a lot of philosophical concepts, but it has a resonance with the kinds of things that we were already saying over here and that we were speaking about when we spoke about in terms of the act. And I'll just emphasize 2 points here. This precarious status of the subject relies, quoting Zizek again, on the Kantian insight that reality is not non-all, ontologically not fully constituted, so it needs the supplement of the subject. I've heard Zizek try to give a far more grounded, basic, everyday example of what does it mean, what is this idea that Kant has this insight that reality is not fully constituted. It's a brilliant example, it's really great. I don't know if video games still work the same way, but when I played video games, those first-person video games a long time ago, you could investigate various parts of your video game world, but every now and again you'd come up to a part where the game hasn't been more fully developed. In other words, the little pixels and the formation of the game isn't quite there. In other words, the whole game is not, every conceivable, imaginable part hasn't been programmed into it. This is a nice way of getting a sense that reality is not all, the ontological status of existence is not all, and what one needs, therefore, what paradoxically ontology needs in order for it to count as seemingly working as a cohesive, consistent entity is the subject. The subjectivized effect of the subject who engages and makes it whole, right? And we had a similar idea here in terms of how we think the relationship between S1 and S2. So let's have one last quote, and what I suppose what we're building to is this notion that the subject as a gap, the subject as a kind of failure, the subject as a kind of disparity, also functions as a conditioned possibility. The subject as irreconcilable somehow still enables reality to function. Subject designates the contingency of an act that sustains the very ontological order of being. So we're linking back to the notion of that act. We'll close then with a quote from Less Than Nothing. This is on page 150. There's lots of these different moments in Zizek where he tries to further articulate the Lacanian subject with reference to various philosophical reference points. Many of them are a little bit opaque, many of them a little bit difficult, but here is one that seems to be more or less accessible. The subject is thwarted and blocked, is impeded, is stigmatized by a constitutive impossibility. Okay, all of the things we've been saying, just slightly stated in a slightly more verbose, philosophically highfalutin way. The subject is the result of its own failure, of the failure of the symbolic representation. A subject endeavors to express itself in a signifier, it fails, and the subject is this failure. This is what Lacan means by his deceptively simple claim that ultimately a subject is what is not an object. Okay, a slightly different interpretation to what I gave of that notion earlier on, but just to bring those two things together, there is the subject as failure who tries to speak, who doesn't get it, who performs some kind of error. The subject endeavors to express itself in a signifier, fails, and that failure is the subject. And again, even in that example, which may sound a little bit confusing because we've got two moments of the subject apparently, the subject trying to express themselves, failing, saying more than, less than, other than what they thought they would, that failure is the subject. So you've got the expressive moment, failure. Those two things seem like a disjunction, and that's the point. That's what the subject is. Both the failed attempt, the expression that doesn't work, and the failure, the kind of fallout effect of that. That irreconcilability, that disparity of those two things is subject. Let's end there.